Good afternoon. What do the most left-wing presidential candidate Bernie Sanders and the arch-capitalist Elon Musk have in common? You might think it's not a lot, but they both believe that jobs are going to disappear dramatically over the next 2 decades. And they're not alone. Goldman Sachs predicts that 300 million jobs are going to disappear by 2030. And it's all very easy to be in our podcast ivory towers talking about these theoretical issues. Last year, we surveyed the British public on what they thought the impact of AI and technology and robots were going to be on the future of the workforce. 1 in 3 believes that AI could do their job in 5 years' time. That's 10 million people across the entire of the United Kingdom. And in fact, 1 in 10 believe that their job could be outperformed by AI today. How quick will employers be to act on this? Well, the signs are they're beginning to. Just last year, BT announced that they would be making 55,000 people redundant by 2030. But I'm here today to give you the positive side of what's going to happen to our job market, the optimistic side, the side that you need to be thinking about as you begin to enter the workforce. But we can't do that without knowing a little bit of the history. And so I wanted to look at the 4 F's for this: firms, factories, farming, and coal faces. When we look at firms, Amazon, one of the world's biggest companies, 10 years ago had 1 robot for every 8 people. As of this year, that is now 1 in 3. Prior to that, we had the coal mines. And in the coal mining industry, we had more people employed 50 years ago than we do in supermarkets today. In addition, when it comes to factories, between 1950 and 2010, their headcount reduced by 75% in the UK. And of course, prior to that, the vast majority of people used to work in farming. That is now less than 2% of our workforce that work there. Yet we produce more food than we have ever done before. And so what's at the centre of all of it? Well, it's always been technology changing. Look at the Luddites there and the cotton spinning wheels. An updated version with AI, of course, for this talk. But it demonstrates that throughout history, our technologies have changed and they've replaced workers. What is the difference this time, though, is the speed and the acceleration with which they are happening. But what is work? What is a job? Well, let's look at the root of it. I mean the literal root of the word. Work partly comes from the phrase orgear, which literally means to press down, to compel. The French word travail comes from the word torture. And French are always a little bit more colourful with their language, perhaps. But why do people want a job in the first place? Well, a lot of it comes from economic security. In other words, a salary, which whilst we're on the history lesson, salary comes from the phrase salt, which is what their Roman armies used to pay their armies in to keep the food fresh. It's where the phrase worth your salt comes from. And it demonstrates that is always the primary need of why people go to work. But there's lots more there as well. People go to work for camaraderie, for a sense of purpose, and a sense of status. And if we go through history, you can see how status has changed a number of times over the years. The Romans used to wear purple because it came from a very rare dye that you could only get from a certain type of snail. In the 1700s, it was pineapples. Pineapples weren't eaten, they were used as decoration, they were that rare. And even in the 1800s, People used to have X-rays hanging in their home. That would look a bit odd now. Of course, this is what AI said status looks like through the ages. I didn't actually say that they should have an amazing health and fitness body, but it is true how that's become much more important over the last 15 and 20 years as a sign of social status is being healthy and fit and being able to talk about it on social media. But of course, employment is a big driver of status as well. In the early 2000s, the pinnacle for top graduates was to go and work at investment banks. And then it became the technology companies, the likes of Google and Facebook. Since then, it's perhaps changed again. One of my favourite questions on Jimmy's Jobs of the Future is to ask the successful people that come on, what would they be looking to do if they were starting their career today? When we had Rishi Sunak on the show, who was at Goldman's in the early noughties, he said that he thought he'd be starting his career now in the creative industries, in the digital sector, or even in filmmaking. And that demonstrates how the status of work is changing and why I believe there will be much more there. And so it's the question that I'm asked most after what is Donald Trump really like in meetings is, what's an irreplaceable job of the future? It's normally the parents that are asking me. And I think they expect some kind of combination of AI, physics, and data. And all of those will be very important. But I also like to give a bit of a counterintuitive example to it. 7 out of every 8 jobs in the United Kingdom are in the private sector. And the private sector's job is quite simple in some ways. It's to research products, create products, go to market with those products, get them in front of people, which is marketing, and then persuade people to buy those products, which is sales. And those jobs have always remained the same with their purpose. But what has changed, particularly in the last 20 years, is the speed and the cost of doing so much of those has reduced dramatically. It is now much easier to have a side hustle and test something on the side, whereas previously you used to have to stop your work on the Friday and start your business on the Monday. And so that's what I say to people when I'm going around schools, is make sure that you're playing with the tools. The tools are always changing, and you need an understanding of how the tools work. Look at all the AI tools that are being released in the last few weeks and months alone. You have the opportunity and the time to embed yourself in these, play with them, understand them. When you enter the workforce in a few years' time, you'll arguably be much better equipped than your older peers to know how to use them. The example that I give of this is look at Stephen Bartlett and Ben Francis, the founder of Gymshark, over the last 10 years. Or even Jordan Schwartzberger, the manager of the Sidemen. They've been able to build million-pound companies, or in Ben's case, a billion-pound company, by understanding the essence of social media, which was a revolution that began in the late noughties. They've been able to build up serious amounts of wealth in their 20s. That would previously have not been possible because the tools wouldn't have been cheap and you couldn't have reached the global markets. That will be what AI is for the next generation. And so, what are the skills that you need? Well, we talked earlier about how we're moving from a knowledge economy, and we've had the decades of the firm. Well, we're going to move to a much more human-centric economy over the next 30 years. As AI is able to do so much more of what our machines do, our human-to-human skills will become more important. Now, there's been a tendency sometimes to call these soft skills, which is not a great phrase. Sometimes they're called perishable skills. And I think these will be what the future is. Because AI are going to change what human incentives are. as we've looked at already. Status has changed and what incentivizes humans. But understanding that human-to-human connection, what drives each other, will be paramount. But the truth is, no one knows what it's going to look like. But you in this room have the opportunity to understand it better than you perhaps might think. You will be the generation that dominates this century's workforce, and you have the opportunity to use AI as a major tool. My name's Jim McLoughlin. As was mentioned, I used to advise the Prime Minister. Now that, until 18 months ago, used to be a really impressive line on its own right. Now I have to qualify it a little bit more. People look at me sort of, were you involved in the parties or were you only there for 45 days? I actually left 4 years ago to start a family. I said to the new Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, I need some headspace to work out what I'm going to do with my career next. Turns out it was quite a lot harder than that. A few months later, the pandemic struck. My wife went back to work in the NHS, and I became a stay-at-home dad to our 6-month-old. I'd literally gone from Downing Street to diapers. I'll let you decide where I had to deal with more crap. But what was interesting was at that stage, I thought, is there something I can do to help tackle the unemployment crisis coming up? And that's where I thought back to the conversations that I used to have in Number 10. It used to be my job to go in and tell the Prime Minister that Debenhams or Wilkinson's over the last few months were closing down and 10,000 people were going to be made redundant. She would say, at this time, all I ever hear about, Jimmy, is job losses. Yet we're at record high employment. Where are all these jobs coming from? And the truth is, it's entrepreneurs creating 1 or 2 jobs a week. It makes careers guidance for the next generation harder than it's ever been before. It was challenging when I was at school and you were just getting the 3 careers that were talked about earlier suggested. It's going to be more challenging. But as the generation that will dominate this century's workforce, if you can understand AI, not be controlled by the AI, but know the tools and how to use them at your advantage, you will become the most powerful generation that's ever existed. AI will create new problems, just as all technologies have. Look at the 3 greatest challenges the West faces at the moment. How do we look after our elderly? How do we tackle obesity? How do we deal with climate change? They all come from human advancement. They all come from people living older, having more food than ever before, and using more electricity. AI will create new problems. We may not know what those problems are yet, but it will be up to your generation to solve them. Thanks very much for listening.